If you thought your grade school years were high pressure, wait until you hear about watercoloring at Hailsham Boarding School. Welcome to Chapter by Chapter. Today, Chapter 2 of Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go. One of the most difficult things about this novel is that it jumps back and forth between different times in Kathy's life. So I wanted to take a second to just establish 4 of the main time frames of the novel. Others will appear, but for the time being, these are the 4 we see in Chapter 2. First off, we have when Kathy is 31. This is present time in the novel, and she's on the cusp of leaving her position as a carer. Then we have Kathy in her 20s, where she and Ruth are reflecting on their school days from Ruth's hospital room. The main action of this chapter happens when Kathy is 13 and she's responding to the bullying that Tommy is undergoing. And finally, we also get a little bit of background knowledge about Tommy when he's around age 10, maybe a little bit earlier, reflecting on his watercolor and when his torment starts. So now that we've established a time frame for the chapter, I want to focus on what we learn about Hailsham in Chapter 2. The first area of interest for me is Kathy's greatest fear. It's come up in Chapter 1, but we see even more of it in Chapter 2, and that seems to be the fear of gossip. Perhaps because it's a boarding school, perhaps because people are right on top of each other. It's very hard to have private conversations, and if you do, then rumors start to churn very, very quickly. Take a listen to this passage. This is Kathy speaking to the reader. I suppose this might sound odd, but at Hailsham the lunch queue was one of the better places to have a private talk. It was something to do with the acoustics in the great hall. All the hubbub and the high ceilings meant that so long as you lowered your voices, stood quite close, and made sure your neighbors were deep in their own chat, you had a fair chance of not being overheard. In any case, we weren't exactly spoilt for choice. Quiet places were often the worst, because there was always someone likely to be passing within earshot. And as soon as you looked like you were trying to sneak off for a secret talk, the whole place seemed to sense it within minutes. So I know that rumors spread quickly at all schools, but this seems like something at a whole nother level from what I'm used to as a student and teacher. Another thing that strikes me as quite interesting in this chapter is that though Hailsham is thought of as such a glorious place, this being most epitomized by the dying man from Dorset who wants to replace his childhood memories with these, it's actually a place of some pretty horrendous stuff happening. Obviously, what happens to Tommy is ridiculously heinous. And a lot of those things I won't even repeat in this video and certainly not show you a picture of because the bullying is both psychological and disgusting and degrading in every way. What we discover in Chapter 2, along with Kathy's recollection, is that this bullying is systemic for the culture of Hailsham here. Listen to this quote. She says, "And it came home to me with a kind of chill that Tommy had been going through what he had been going through, not just for weeks or months, but for years." So obviously Hailsham has a gossip and a bullying problem, but what school doesn't? The thing we find in Chapter 2 that really sets Hailsham apart is the exchanges. Listen to Kathy explain it. 4 times a year, spring, summer, autumn, winter, we had a kind of big exhibition cum sale. All of the things we'd been creating in the 3 months since the last exchange. Paintings, drawings, pottery, all sorts of sculptures made from whatever was the craze of the day. Bashed up cans, maybe, or bottle tops stuck onto cardboard. For each thing you put in, you were paid in exchange tokens. The guardians decided how many your particular masterpiece merited, and then on the day of the exchange, you went along with your tokens and bought the stuff you liked. The rule was you could only buy work done by students in your own year, but that still gave us plenty to choose from, since most of us could get pretty prolific over a 3-month period. On the surface, the exchanges might sound like a fun, maybe high-pressure group activity, but it's not until we look at how these characters are reacting to the exchanges and influenced by them that we see just how powerful the concept of creating is at Hailsham. 2 characters show us just how influential the exchanges are on the students at the school. The first is obviously Tommy. In some ways, creation and art is the cause of his torment. He created a watercolor, which is not his strong suit, painting, not what he's great at. He created a watercolor and he made it very childlike, maybe on purpose, maybe because he couldn't do much better, and he kind of played it off as a joke, but a good-hearted teacher tried to make the best of it, and it only ended up making other people jealous and resentful and spiteful of all the praise Tommy was getting for what was otherwise a rather childish watercolor. So Tommy, the best athlete in the school, a strong kid, is bullied for years because he's bad at art. This is very different than what I'm used to seeing at high schools. And more interestingly, the release from being creative that he talks about at the end of the chapter seems to be the catalyst to his bullying going away. And even though being told that he doesn't have to worry about being creative is probably saving his life based on the path he's going down at this school, Kathy can't believe it. She says he's talking rubbish because it is so foreign a concept for her that creating things isn't important. The less obvious example of a character being incredibly influenced by creation is Ruth. So Ruth is clearly a leader. She's respected, maybe a little bit feared. For example, earlier in the chapter, Kathy's talking about Tommy and how much bullying he's undergoing, and when she's done speaking, no one in her dorm says anything. They sit there in silence, and Kathy says, "I realized everyone was waiting for Ruth's response." No one wants to take Kathy's side with Tommy or speak out against it out of fear that Ruth might have the opposite approach. So clearly, Ruth is very influential. And yet, when you go back to the timeline of Kathy and Ruth in their 20s, reflecting on their time at Hailsham, we learn about a character named Christy, and Kathy says, "Even you, Ruth, you didn't dare boss Christy around, all because we thought she was great at poetry." So Ruth, who has no problem bossing people around and exerting her influence over others, is intimidated by better artists than her. After all, as it says in the chapter, a lot of the time, how you were regarded at Hailsham, how much you were liked and respected, had to do with how good you were at creating. One final little piece of information you're going to want to make sure you get from this chapter is we meet two new characters who will come up later in the book. First is Miss Emily. She is the headmaster, and it's worth noting that she usually oversees the art classes. And the second is Miss Lucy, and she's a guardian who tells Tommy that it is all right to not be creative. Something that has such an influence on him that this kid who had to have his arms pinned behind him out of anger because he was throwing desks across the room suddenly has self-confidence and lets the insults and teasing wash right over him and not affect him. So obviously whatever Miss Lucy told him, very important. And you're going to get more of that in the next chapter. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this was helpful, and I hope to see you in chapter 3. Happy reading.